My name is C. Roser, and you're in my studio now. And I was born in Philadelphia, and I have lived in India, Pakistan, China, the Philippines, Germany, and points in between. My first memories was as a child crawling on the floor on a patterned Persian rug and trying to catch the light beams from a stained glass window which was reflecting on the carpet. And I think, and I believe that's my first memory. I started to paint because I knew I wanted to do something to express myself. When I was in the Philippines, in Manila, a friend of mine lent me an oil set that his mother had sent him. And I painted an oil painting, and I took it out to be framed. And I actually had been doing photography before that too. And I actually painted an image from one of my photographs. I took it to be framed and somebody wanted to buy it. And I thought, oh, maybe this is what I should be doing. There were no real important art schools in Manila. So then my husband was in the Foreign Service. We were transferred to Berlin, Germany, and they had a wonderful school there. So I took the exam and I passed, and I, in earnest, started to become an artist. It wasn't easy because there was no heat in Berlin at that time. People were still assembling bricks from all the bombing that had taken place there. And food was in short supply, and the school was in an old Gothic building. It was the Hochschule für Bildende Kunst, and it was considered a college-level art school. And there was no heating, and being German, you're expected to paint from 8 to 5, and no playing around. And my teacher was named Hans Ullmann, my first teacher, and he was a sculptor and a wonderful artist. I never thought of other artists being my mentors. I always thought of them as friends, but that was a long time ago. And two people that really influenced me were Charmaine van Wiegand, who's a member of the American Abstract Artists, and another friend whose name is Shari Deans, who's completely the opposite. She was one of the influencers of Fluxus, and she also was a friend of Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg and John Cage. In fact, Jasper Johns used to have a studio right next to me in 106th Street in Riverside, and I can see his studio. He was in the penthouse from my window. Also, Alice Neal was right on 107th Street in Broadway. So all of these people influence you. But what really made me think about art was these two older women artists. Charmian was working in a small apartment. She had one tiny room on East 34th Street which she used as her studio. And everything in the apartment was not matching, and she had these wonderful parties where she would invite artists, dealers, writers, because her husband was a writer, and then she would serve coffee, drinks, and cake, and we would get together and talk about art. And they used to have shows at the Riverside Museum on 103rd and Riverside. And after the show, she would bring all of her friends over here to have tea and cookies. And it was cold, and this was a nice place for them to visit at that time. And she would bring people like Burgoyne Diller, Alice Trumbull Mason, and she would bring dealers like Rose Freed and Bruce White, and also Ronnie Elliott, and other people. After several visits, Ruth White offered me my first show. My first show was called Visionary Gardens, and I sold several pieces, and as a result of that show, I was invited to show at the Columbus Museum of Contemporary Art in Ohio, and I was also invited to the Brooklyn Museum to show one of my watercolors, and I got a review in the New York newspapers. So that was a great beginning, and also Jill Johnson wrote about me in one of the art magazines. My work is very spontaneous. I do series, but it's inadvertent. I tend to work and produce several paintings that are related, and then I move on to something else. And I'm not terribly critical of my work. I know that Charming was a great influence on me because she would come and look and she would say, well, these are very interesting, but why don't you edit your work? Do you ever edit your work? And I said no. And then after she said that, I realized I should go over it again and look at it again, not just paint it and leave it, which was my tendency. I was very fortunate in that several other shows that I had were all reviewed in the newspapers and in the magazines. And I'm sure that encouraged me, but the most of all, it encouraged other people to show me. I had several shows at the Ruth White Gallery, and when she closed, I was, after a certain period of time, I was picked up by the Barbara Ingbar show, and then I had a house at that time in Southampton. So I used to show out in Southampton at the Guildhall and at the Benson Gallery. And of course, out there, all the artists were out there. Everybody was accessible. You could meet Bill King on the streets or in a gallery. You could go to his openings. He would invite you down to Chinatown after an opening of one of his shows. Elaine de Kooning was available, Bill King, and so many other artists like Herman Cherry. They were all out in the Hamptons, and they were all not wealthy. They were all struggling. And so there was a great camaraderie there and a great spirit. I want to talk about Shara Deans because she was a great influence on me. She was influential in the Fluxus movement. She was a great friend of Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg. They used to come to her studio. She had a studio in Carnegie Hall, and she was so spontaneous and so inventive. She had several shows and was one of the leading members of AIR Gallery. And she was friends with Yoko Ono, and she brought John Cage to my place. And I feel that she was a very free spirit and completely different from Charming. Charming was more classical. And I think these two women had a profound influence on me because I could see both sides. This studio is very important to me because when I enter the door, it's like a hand going into a glove. And the only thing I can do here is work. And that is part of my discipline. In this studio, I started a group called Women in the Arts, which went on and gained momentum, and we organized ourselves first with just 12 or 15 women, and it ballooned until we protested in front of the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney, and also Brooklyn, and we ended up being Women in the Arts, and we were the first group to organize a all-women's show of women's work in a major museum here in New York City. It was in the Art and Design Museum, and the show was called Women Choose Women. When we were demonstrating in front of the Museum of Modern Art, everybody was there. Joan Mitchell just gotten off the plane, and she was there. Louise Bourgeois had gotten her husband to come from across the street in front of MoMA, and she had a huge bed sheet. On it was written, "No." And Pat Paslow had a sign saying, "MoMA loves Papa." That show was juried by Mario Amaya, who was the director of the museum, and Linda Nochlin, Elizabeth Baker, Sylvia Slee, Pat Paslow, and myself. And we did it by slides, no names. We just put the slides up and we voted on who was in and who was out. And it ended up including most of the major women artists of today.